Chicago Tonight, Black Voices is made possible in part by Fifth Third Bank and by the support of these donors.
At Fifth Third, we believe when diverse voices are heard and empowered, communities are made stronger, lives are made better, and the future holds greater promise for all. That's why we're proud to support Chicago Tonight Black Voices. Together, we can make a difference. Together, we can drive change.
Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. I'm Brandis Friedman. Thanks for sharing part of your weekend with us. On the show tonight, Queen Elizabeth's death led to widespread mourning, but also sparked conversations about the legacy of the British Empire. The mother of a teen killed in a shooting is teaming up with charter schools in hopes of ending gun violence.
You could wake up one day and get that phone call that says, you need to go to the emergency room, your kidneys are failing.
Meet a local woman on a mission to raise awareness of kidney disease. And arts correspondent Angel Edo introduces us to a local artist turning discarded materials into art honoring Black history. First off tonight, Queen Elizabeth's death prompted an outpouring of grief among many people in Britain and beyond. To many, her 70-year reign was a symbol of tradition and stability. But on her death, along with expressions of sympathy, many people from former colonies and here in America have pushed back on the glorification of the monarchy and empire. We recently spoke with Northwestern's history professor Scott Sowerby, as well as political science professor Alvin Tillery, and Sienna Graves, a producer at WBEZ, who recently wrote an editorial about her family's life under British rule in Jamaica. I began by asking Greaves about the mixed emotions she says she felt upon hearing of the Queen's death.
I felt a lot of things that morning upon hearing of the Queen's declining health. And then, her passing, I was very taken aback that my initial thoughts were actually with my mother and my grandmother. I felt very close to them at that time, having lost my mom at 17 and, now being in my 40s. It was the first time that I really kind of sat and understood really the conditions and the struggle of her life and what it meant for her to be, a child of empire and what she had to go through to get to this country. And it was a lot to think. So there was the sadness for the Queen, but also sadness for my own family.
To that end, you wrote that the British monarchy will always symbolize imperialism, slavery, murder, and white supremacy. And yet, when you learned of her death, you happened to be in the UK on an already planned trip. You laid a bouquet of flowers at the palace gates. Why did you want to do that?
I think that's something that, my mother and grandmother would have wanted. They always had an affection for the Queen and the royal family. They were never ignorant of their own situation. They obviously understood their own history and the history of their nation and why they were in the situation and the inequality and injustice around them. But, very much like here in the United States, there is a complicated relationship. America is my home. I do understand the history of injustice and the history of inequality that Black people have had to face in this country. So, again, like I said in the piece, she, never made it to England. She never made it to see, the Queen's palace. So that was just something that I could do for her in that moment.
Alvin Tillery, the British Empire was founded on the notion of Christian white supremacy growing rich off the slave trade. What is the relationship between European colonialism, British colonialism particularly, and the America and the inequality that we know and see here in America and the Western Hemisphere?
Well, as you know, Brandon, there's a bright line connection. I mean, you just articulated it. The enterprise of indigenous dispossession and genocide and the slave trade as propagated by the Royal Africa Company that sort of imported 3.1 million slaves directly from Africa to the Western Hemisphere is really sort of the beginning of the American story, the story of the American race monster that we are constantly living with today. And so the fingerprints of the British Empire are all over that story.
Alvin, do you think that the Queen's death will lead to a much more thorough examination of the legacy of empire?
Well, I think yes and no. I mean, I think the contradictions that Sienna pointed to, we all live with, right? I mean, this is a modern figure who, of course, is not responsible fully for the freight of the entire history of British colonialism. But at the same time, I think we've been re-examining this legacy since the independence movement that freed India and the African colonies and the Caribbean nations, right? And so it's a very clear that England and France and the other colonial powers, the wealth of these nations is predicated upon unlawful takings from the global South, from Black and brown and Asian bodies. And so we've been talking more about that over the last couple of decades. I think instances like the Queen dying just give us a chance to crystallize that conversation for people who've been taught intentionally the wrong history.
Scott Sowerby, obviously the transatlantic slave trade long gone by the time Queen Elizabeth took the throne, but how much was the British monarch historically involved in the slave trade? And to the same question, though, how much of the British monarchs and, of course, British wealth is built on the sins of the empire?
Well, just to follow up what Alvin said, the empire represented a huge transfer of wealth from the rest of the world to Britain, and the British monarchy was at the forefront of that. In fact, the very first governor of the Royal African Company that Alvin mentioned was the brother to the king. It was the future James II. He became king himself in 1685. And that wealth has been passed on from generation to generation. So the question is, should some of that wealth now be given back? That's really something the monarchy has to face, I think.
Okay, so let's get into that in just a minute. Before we do that, I want to ask, though, do you think the Queen's death will lead to a lot of countries in the Caribbean and beyond to give up the British monarchy as head of state and become republics?
So there are only 15 countries left in the world that still have the British monarch as their head of state. And I think 8 of them are in the Caribbean, and Barbados became a republic last year. And of those 8 countries in the Caribbean, 6 of them have indicated that they may consider dropping the now Charles III as their head of state. I think Jamaica is definitely one country that could go that way. And maybe Sienna could talk to that too.
Sounds like chances are high. Sienna, last year, Prince William, Kate Middleton, had what was viewed as a disastrous trip to the Caribbean because of protests. And while the couple expressed regret, they did not formally apologize for slavery. At this point, would an apology be enough?
It's a start. We want these conversations around reparatory justice to, continue. But I'm not convinced that there is an appetite for that conversation within the British government, let alone the royal family. Interesting, when I was in England, I got into a black taxi and we were speaking to our cab driver about, how he felt about the death of the Queen. And he said, she was our monarch and I'll miss her. But if you ask my kids and my grandkids, they'll bring up colonization. And, England was invaded by France 1,000 years ago. You just have to get over it. You just have to move on. That's what we heard from David Cameron when he visited Jamaica. And the question of reparations came up in 2015, I believe it is. So there is, thank you for acknowledging and, expressing regret. But I think starting at a formal apology will be, a start.
It's a starting point.
So, yeah.
Alvin Tillery, what is the likelihood that the British or any other former colonial powers will be forced to pay any sort of reparations?
Well, I think at this point it's unlikely, but I do want to underscore what Sienna and Scott are saying is that the conversation won't necessarily be driven by the conservative government in England or the monarch. It'll be driven by nations in the global South, like Jamaica, who's already moving to sue England for $10.5 billion or $10.6 billion in reparations. And I also want to point out that what the cab driver said to Sienna is completely false. The entire functioning of these societies in the global South the way their economies work and do not work for their people is predicated on the structures that were set up by these colonial powers. They are meant to be extraction points for the markets of England and France and the other colonial powers. They still function that way. And so reparations would be forthcoming if we could find a way for those consumers in those spaces that are the Commonwealth to sever those ties. I believe that reparations would be a much cheaper option than losing those markets for England.
Again, that was Northwestern University professors Alvin Tillery and Scott Sowerby, as well as WBEZ producer Sienna Greaves, speaking about the aftermath of Queen Elizabeth's death. Up next, a local mom pushing to end gun violence in Chicago in a conversation recorded earlier. It was a story that shook the nation. A 15-year-old girl who had just performed just days earlier at President Obama's second inauguration, shot and killed in a park just blocks from her school. 9 years after her death, Hadiya Pendleton's mother, Cleopatra Cowley Pendleton, is still fighting to end gun violence. She joins us now to talk about her partnership with charter schools and more. Cleopatra, thank you for joining us. So today we know that the Illinois Network of Charter Schools released a brief on the role of charter schools in combating gun violence. Hadiya was a charter student. She graduated from University of Chicago Charter Woodlawn before she went to King College Prep. As a charter mom, what do you see is the role of charters in addressing violence in the community?
I think that charter schools are always pioneering things. Like, they definitely work with families and communities and are always open to partnering with other schools and or officials with anything that's directly related to the betterment of its students and their families.
You mentioned pioneering, of course. Are charter schools sort of uniquely positioned to test out different options and opportunities because they are not district operated?
I think they're funded differently, and therefore they have maybe some flexibilities that the Chicago Public Schools do not have. But it was a public school chart. Inks is obviously one of those public charter schools, and so still neighborhood students and such are definitely able to benefit from the program that they have and all the different ideas that are going to be for the betterment of the students.
So, of course, like many CPS schools, and it should be clarified, obviously, all CPS schools are dealing with this, not just charter schools. But the district's charter schools are overwhelmingly black and brown students, overwhelmingly low income. This brief from the Illinois Network of Charter Schools says that 80 charters have reported at least one gunshot within one block of campus. 64 charters reported at least 100 gunshots within 5 blocks of campus. As a mother, what do you think when you hear that?
Devastating, right? Because, and as I shared today when I met with the other the attendees at the conference today, that's not things I had to think about when I was coming up, and I think it's so terrible that these young people today are being robbed of their youth and have to even think about the safety and the capacity of whether or not I'll see my classmate and or friend again because of the frequency of gun violence. It's Friday. Will I see you on Monday? I think it's absolutely terrible.
What are some of the resources that you think students, young people need? What are some of the resources that they have access to already?
Well, I mean, there's a number of different resources that they have access to already. However, we all have to step up with the roles that we play as it relates to young people and our responsibility within their lives. If we see them doing right, great. Let's reach out and, tell them great job. We see them doing wrong. Either we approach them directly or maybe their families and talk about that. What we cannot do is act like that the issues that are happening are not an issue for every household. It's not just unique to Black and brown communities. And if it is displayed in our communities right now, it's not before long before it hits your community.
We hear a lot of talk, of course, about policing in and around schools. What do you think is the role of law enforcement in our schools?
You know what? Law enforcement has its place. But what I will say is that there are many other levels of involvement that can be executed or adhered to before we get to policing, because as we know, unfortunately, sometimes the police bring about a fear for our youth. I mean, back when I was coming up, we looked up to the police. You know, nowadays so much stuff has happened, and there's a lack of empathy and sympathy. And mind you, I'm not saying that all police are wrong, because by no means would I be saying that. You know, I have so many relationships in a lot of different capacities with members of the police force. However, I think that you know, there are other people that can step up and become more involved or engaged with our youth before we reach out to the police.
What more would you like to see done in schools? You know, again, we talk about policing, but we've also heard we can't police our way out of this, out of our violence problem. What other steps need to be taken?
Yeah, it's not the police that's the problem by any means. I think as it relates to the school system, you know, we need to throw as much money as we can that way, because we have people who are invested in our youth, who definitely want to see them do better and what's best for themselves. However, our young people need to know that there are many other options available, right, other than violence. And if we help them identify those things, 9 times out of 10, we'll start to see some sort of change occur in the violence that's happening out here.
Long road ahead, a lot of work to still be done. Cleopatra Hadiya Pendleton, we thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Back with more Chicago Tonight Black Voices right after this. Known as a silent illness, chronic kidney disease can lead to life-altering consequences. Chicago Tonight reporter Joanna Hernandez tells us more about a woman's journey to raise awareness through her own battle.
You can either be happy about it or you can turn it into positive energy.
It's been 7 years since Quinn Taylor received a kidney transplant. She was in college when her kidney started to fail.
I was diagnosed at the age of 20. I was away at school and my body just freaked out. I had blood drawn and got a phone call at 5 o'clock that evening saying, "Miss Taylor, you need to go to the emergency room. Your kidneys are failing." And it was one of the most defining moments of my life.
In a blink of an eye, Taylor's life changed direction. She was joining her father's battle with chronic kidney disease.
When my doctor let me know that I would have to start dialysis, my dad was actually going back to dialysis from having had a transplant that lasted him 10 years. So we literally dialyzed together and sat across from each other and shared that experience together.
Her journey was tough, but Quinn says her father inspired her to keep fighting. After being on kidney dialysis for 5 years, she received a transplant at 32 years old. Her father, Eddie Taylor, died shortly after her transplant.
It was a very hard time to lose him, but I always find peace that he knew I was okay, and so because he knew I would be okay and I had a kidney, that he could leave me so that I could be great and do all these wonderful things that I get to do.
Taylor is now making it her mission to help others navigate through the challenges of having a chronic medical illness through her business, Tailoring Gratitude.
I think it's so important for people to go to their healthcare providers and say, "I need to be screened for kidney disease. I have diabetes. I have high blood pressure." I work with different organizations.
Dr. Sunil Udani is a specialist in kidney care and also the chair of the advisory board of the National Kidney Foundation of Illinois.
As a kidney doctor, I'm saying your kidneys are essential. Yes, you can live with one kidney. That's why people can donate a kidney and still live a long, healthy life and have no problems. Even people that are born with one kidney can oftentimes live a long, healthy life with normal kidney function. But we have to be extra careful about protecting those.
Last year, the National Kidney Foundation launched Kidney Health for Life, a campaign focused on educating and targeting the high rate of kidney disease among Black, Asian, and Latino populations.
When we look at the issues of health disparities, for example, nearly 1 in 4 persons, or Black persons, are more likely to get kidney disease than the Caucasian population, and for the Latina population, it's 1 in 3.
Known as a silent disease, Dr. Udani says it's common for people to be living with early stages of kidney disease and have no symptoms. In an effort to reach out to underserved communities, the foundation sends a kidney mobile to provide free testing.
People just come and they can get a quick blood test and a urine test, and we get test results very quickly, and then there are doctors like myself that will be there to interpret.
The National Kidney Foundation says more than 3,000 people are added to the kidney transplant waiting list each month.
Although I thrive and help other people to survive, this isn't a life I would give to anyone.
As Taylor continues her work as an advocate, survivor, and motivational speaker, she says there's one person always by her side.
My dad is very proud of the work that I am doing. I wear this necklace in everything I do, and inside of it, there are ashes of my dad. And so I know that he's always with me. I know that he's part of my motivation.
For Chicago Tonight, Black Voices, I'm Joanna Hernandez.
And according to the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention, kidney disease is the 9th leading cause of death in Illinois. You can visit our website to learn more about the work being done at the National Kidney Foundation of Illinois. What it was, what it is, and what it shall be. That's how artist Nick Cave describes his 3-part exhibition on display at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago as he works to reclaim identity with help from discarded objects. Arts correspondent Angel Edo takes us to For Other More.
It's a full circle moment, literally, for Nick Cave as he takes a look back at his career in full in a new exhibit at the MCA titled For Other More.
You'll see tondos, a series of sound suits, old as well as most current ones that are really sort of based on George Floyd. And then you'll see a number of other sculptural sort of works throughout the show.
It's in repurposed objects of all types that Cave works to acknowledge and celebrate the new life he's found and the objects that were once discarded. This comes after decades of traveling as an emerging artist, creating art with nothing more than what surrounded him.
Materials also provides a way in for a lot of the audience, that there's something that you are going to be able to relate to that's familiar.
But reclaiming discarded objects is not the only narrative Cave works to address.
For decades have been trying to bring light to the subject of racism, inequality, and justice. And at the same time, I have to sort of resolve that within myself. Every time something happens, I've got to resolve it. Otherwise, it could destroy me. I'm sort of interested in, shifting the narrative and sort of owning our history, owning our past, and being resilient in that sort of process. And how do you sort of like psychologically work through manipulative sort of ways of calculating how we sort of exist and saying no to that? And so it's my way of sort of recognizing and putting it in your face, but at the same time, elevating it and empowering it.
No matter the medium, Cave says he hopes his work serves as a vehicle for change as he continues what he describes as his civic responsibility to speak for the voices that are not heard.
I want to sort of take you on this journey. I want there to be moments of silence. I want there to be moments of stillness. And I want you to find ways in which you feel that you can come to the work and be open to something that is unfamiliar, that looks different. And how do we sort of step up to that?
For Chicago Tonight Black Voices, I'm Angel Ito.
And if you haven't seen it, this is your last chance. Furthermore is on display at the MCA through October 2nd. And that's our show for this weekend. Be sure to check out our website, WTTW.com/news, for the very latest from WTTW News. And if you're watching us on Saturday night, know that you can also catch Black Voices and Latino Voices on Sundays beginning at 10 p.m. And join me and Paris Schutz next week at 7 on Chicago Tonight. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight Black Voices, I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for sharing part of your weekend with us. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud of its partners named Illinois leading lawyers by the Law Bulletin Publishing Company of Chicago.